The music was loud, the laughter even louder. The party was in full swing, red cups in hand, expensive liquor flowing, and a sea of well-dressed guests lost in conversation. No one noticed him at first. He had walked in like everyone else, blending into the crowd, his tailored suit fitting just right, his confidence effortless. But then someone whispered. A glance turned into a murmur into a sneer. And before he knew it, he was surrounded, accused of crashing the party, of not belonging. The hostility was subtle at first, masked behind fake smiles and forced politeness. Then it wasn't. Security was called. He was escorted out. What no one realized, what no one even thought to ask, was who he really was. Outside, the night was crisp, the city buzzing with life. He stood on the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, watching as the security guard who had just kicked him out strutted back inside, oblivious. The irony made him chuckle. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang once before a voice answered. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" "Shut it down," he said calmly. "Excuse me, sir?" "The party. Shut it down. Now." There was a pause on the other end, then a hurried response. "Right away, sir." Inside the penthouse, the music suddenly stopped. The lights flickered, and murmurs of confusion spread through the crowd. Moments later, the same security guard who had thrown him out received a call. His face paled as he listened. Then, with wide eyes, he turned toward the guests and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you, the party is over." Gasps and protests erupted. "What do you mean, over? Who says?" Someone demanded. And just as they spoke, the elevator doors slid open. He stepped inside, adjusting his cuff again, the soft click of his shoes against the marble floor silencing the room. "I do," he said. Silence. Recognition dawned on their faces. Too late. The man they had humiliated, the man they had judged, the man they had thrown out of his own home. And now they were the ones unwelcome. The silence was suffocating. Eyes darted around the room, searching for some excuse, some way to justify what had just happened. But there was none. The weight of their mistake hung in the air, thick and undeniable. He stepped forward, his presence commanding. The same people who had sneered at him moments ago now looked away, suddenly fascinated by their drinks, their shoes, anything but his gaze. The bartender hesitated, unsure whether to keep serving. The DJ, hands hovering over the equipment, glanced nervously at security. The party, once vibrant and full of laughter, had collapsed into uneasy whispers and shifting feet. He took his time, walking past the grand piano, past the glittering chandeliers, past the very people who had dismissed him. He could feel their shame, their discomfort. He let them. At the center of the room, he stopped. This wasn't just about a party. It never was. It was about the assumptions, the quiet exclusions, the way people like him were treated as outsiders in spaces they built. His father had stood in rooms like this decades ago, unwelcomed despite his wealth, his brilliance, his accomplishments. His grandfather before him had built businesses that catered to people who would never see him as an equal. And here he was, yet another black man mistaken for someone who didn't belong. He exhaled slowly. Then, with a measured grace, he turned toward the security guard. the one who had thrown him out without a second thought. "You're fired." A single sentence. Nothing more. No anger. No need for it. Just fact. The man stammered, eyes pleading, but he was already invisible. Then he faced the rest of them, the privileged guests who had taken for granted the luxury of never questioning their place. "You can all leave." Some scoffed, others hesitated, hoping he was joking. He wasn't. One by one, they filed out, no longer arrogant, no longer laughing, just exposed. And as the last guest disappeared, the doors shut with a quiet finality. He stood there for a moment, alone in the house he owned, in the space he had reclaimed. Then finally he smiled. Not out of triumph, not out of spite, but because he had just rewritten the story. The echoes of their departure lingered in the vast penthouse. The scent of expensive cologne and spilled champagne clung to the air, but the energy had shifted. For the first time that night, the space belonged to him again. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city, a skyline his investments had helped shape, a world that was his in ways those guests could never understand. They had dismissed him, thrown him out of his own home, and yet, he wasn't angry. He was used to this, but being used to something didn't mean accepting it. His phone vibrated. A message. "Saw what happened. You good?" He smirked. It was from David, his business partner and oldest friend. Word traveled fast. "Better than ever," he replied. As he set the phone down, his eyes landed on the invitation still resting on the bar. A formal, embossed card with his company's name at the top. Tonight's party wasn't just any gathering. It was supposed to be a celebration, a landmark deal, a new chapter for his company. Yet, half the people in that room hadn't even realized who he was. They had come for the status, for the open bar, for the illusion of exclusivity. And in doing so, they had exposed themselves. He poured himself a drink, taking a slow sip as an idea formed. Maybe this was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe it was time to stop offering seats at a table where people like him were only tolerated, not welcomed. He reached for his phone again, this time making a call. "Mr. Carter?" His assistant answered immediately. "Cancel next week's event," he said. "Sir, we're doing something different." A pause. Then, without hesitation, "Understood." He ended the call, his mind racing. This wasn't the end of the night. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The city stretched before him, glittering and alive, but his mind was already elsewhere, on what came next. He wasn't interested in revenge. That would be easy. Too easy. What he wanted was something lasting, something that would reshape the very spaces that had tried to push him out. His father had always told him, "Power isn't about what you have. It's about what you choose to do with it." And tonight he had made a choice. His company had spent years cultivating relationships with investors, executives, and high-profile guests who saw value in what he built, but not in who he was. That ended now. No more deals with people who only respected his name on paper, not his presence in the room. No more partnerships with those who smiled in meetings but wouldn't recognize him at their own events. He tapped open a contact list filled with names. People who truly mattered, who understood not just the business, but the mission behind it. Entrepreneurs, creators, dreamers, the ones who had been overlooked, underestimated, or written off. A new party, a new kind of event. But this time, the guest list would be different. The next morning, headlines would buzz about how a high-profile gathering had been abruptly shut down. They'd speculate, whisper, and wonder why. Some of those guests would realize their mistake too late, scrambling for an apology, a way back in. But the doors had already closed behind them. The next time they saw him, it wouldn't be at their parties. It would be at his. And this time, they wouldn't be invited. The next morning, the world woke up to headlines. Billionaire shuts down his own party. Guests left in shock. Exclusive event ends abruptly. But was it about more than just a party? When the host becomes the outsider, a lesson in privilege, speculation ran wild. Some called it a power move, others a scandal. But those who truly understood saw it for what it was, an awakening. Meanwhile, he wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't explaining himself. He had already said everything that needed to be said with one simple act, taking back his space. Instead, he was focused on something far bigger. The new event came together quietly, deliberately. No press releases, no flashy promotions. Just personal invitations sent to a different kind of guest list. People who had spent their lives being told they didn't belong only to rise anyway. The night of the event, the energy was different. No hushed whispers of judgment. No side glances sizing up who fit and who didn't. Just laughter, conversation, and a sense of belonging that money couldn't buy. A young black entrepreneur stood by the bar, shaking his head in awe. "I've never been in a room like this before," he admitted. An artist who had been rejected by elite galleries for years leaned over and whispered, "Neither have I." He smiled, listening, watching. This was the real power, not just owning the building, but deciding who got to feel at home inside it. And across the city, the people from the old party, those who had dismissed him without a second thought, were starting to realize something. They had been removed from a space they thought was theirs. For the first time, they were the outsiders. And the doors? They weren't opening back up. The next morning, as the sun spilled over the city skyline, he sat in his office, sipping his coffee, scanning the messages flooding his phone. Some were from old acquaintances, people who had been at that party, now suddenly eager to reconnect. "Hey man, I think there was some kind of misunderstanding. Would love to grab lunch and clear the air. Didn't realize it was your event, bro. No hard feelings, right? I respect what you did. Hope there's a way to work together in the future." He chuckled. The shift was predictable. When people saw power, they adjusted. Not because they had learned anything, but because they feared being left out. He ignored them all. Instead, he focused on the messages that mattered. "Thank you for last night. That was the first time I felt like I truly belonged in a room like that. I never thought I'd meet investors who actually care about businesses like mine. You made that happen. We should do this more often. A space that's ours, not one we're just allowed into." He leaned back, letting their words settle. For years, he had played the game, worn the right suits, spoken the right way, built an empire brick by brick, making himself undeniable. But no matter how much success he gained, some people still saw only his skin before his worth. So now he wasn't asking for a seat at their table anymore. He was building his own. And as the city moved on, as boardrooms and penthouses continued their cycles of exclusivity, they hadn't realized one thing. The most powerful rooms weren't the ones that locked people out. They were the ones that opened doors to those who had never been given the key. And this was just the beginning. A month later, the city had moved on, but the ripple effect of that night had not. His name, once spoken in hushed admiration in boardrooms, now carried a new weight, not just as a billionaire, a businessman, or a success story, but as someone who had drawn a line in the sand. Some doors quietly closed to him, old investors who didn't like the shift, partners who preferred the status quo. He expected that. He welcomed it, because for every door that shut, new ones opened. The right ones. His company took a different direction, not just profit, but purpose. He started investing in small businesses that had been overlooked, funding young entrepreneurs who reminded him of himself. He built spaces where talent, not privilege, dictated who belonged. And the most surprising part? Others followed. More black and brown executives started taking ownership, not just in their careers, but in the spaces they occupied. More young visionaries saw that they didn't have to wait for a seat at someone else's table. They could build their own. One night, at yet another event, one of his now, he stood by the balcony, watching the city hum with life. A woman, a tech founder he had backed, walked up beside him. "You ever think about how different things could have been if they hadn't kicked you out that night?" she asked. He smiled. "I think about how different things are because they did." The lesson had never been about exclusion. It had been about realization. He had never been the one who didn't belong. They were just the ones who never saw him coming. And now they would never forget.